why does the overwhelming majority of human behavioral change just violently collapse right at the dawn of the cycle?
Yeah, right at the start.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not a lack of willpower. It's not some deficiency of character. I mean, imagine this universally recognizable scenario. You're standing on the precipice of a monumental life shift.
We've all been there.
Right. You are actively trying to break an old destructive habit, or maybe you're finally stepping toward this wildly ambitious new horizon that you've dreamed about for a passage of eras. You do everything right.
You put in the effort.
You put in that immense agonizing effort. You completely re-architect your daily routines. You force yourself into action. And yet, just as you feel the momentum really building, this invisible tether suddenly pulls taut.
Yeah, it snaps you right back.
It snaps you back into the exact same cycle you are desperately trying to escape.
Mm-hmm.
And well, that brings us to the core mission of our intensive exploration today.
Because it is an invisible wall, right? Nearly everyone hits it, usually right at the exact moment of a breakthrough. And we frame it as self-sabotage, but the actual, functional mechanics of that wall are just entirely misunderstood by the lion's share of society.
We treat it like a moral failing.
Exactly, when in reality, it's a psychological and neurological trap. The linguistic frameworks we use aren't just passive descriptions of our reality, they're the active blueprints.
Right, which means we are our own invisible wardens. The bars of our cells aren't forged from iron or inescapable external circumstances. They are constructed and reinforced and locked by the everyday vocabulary we literally whisper to ourselves.
Yeah, when we use certain phrases, we're unconsciously biologically programming our nervous systems to seek out failure.
So today we're going to examine these invisible collective forces that actively bind human potential. We'll identify a specific sequence of three seemingly innocent everyday phrases that just utterly dismantle your ability to shape your world.
And more importantly, we're going to dissect the exact psychological counter-frameworks you need to reclaim that potential. But to understand how to rewrite those blueprints, we first have to understand the environment we're building in.
Right.
We have to look at the massive, unseen forces of collective human psychology.
Let's lay the groundwork for that, because the way I visualize this constant striving and failing is, well, it's like walking on a colossal invisible treadmill.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
You're jogging along, right?
Yeah.
Matching the comfortable, predictable pace of everyone else in the system. But the very moment you attempt to step off, to alter your trajectory and walk your own path, the treadmill suddenly accelerates.
It actively fights your exit.
Yes. And the cruelest irony is that the treadmill is powered by the very words you are using to express your desire to escape it.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the concept of collective frequency, or what we can call the invisible gravity of the collective mind.
The invisible gravity.
Yeah. In the architecture of human existence, a solitary mind possesses just immense generative power. When a single individual aligns a specific focused thought, which acts as the directional coordinates with a profound visceral emotion.
Which is like the combustible fuel.
Exactly, the fuel. When you combine those, you emit a highly specific neurological and psychological state.
So we're talking about a distinct state of being, like a localized psychological climate that a person carries around with them.
Yeah, broadcasting their internal reality to the external world through, their behaviors, microexpressions, choices, all of it.
Okay, so what happens when you scale that?
Right, scale that phenomenon. Imagine an endless tide of minds, a vast constellation of individuals, all experiencing the exact same psychological climate simultaneously.
Like a shared anxiety or something.
Exactly. When an immense proportion of society shares a collective anxiety, a shared frustration, or a unified fear, they don't merely experience it in isolation.
They sync up.
They sync their nervous systems. Through the biological mechanisms of limbic resonance and emotional contagion, they give birth to a conceptual, self-sustaining psychological organism.
Wow.
It becomes a blind, purpose-driven intelligence woven right into the fabric of culture.
I want to pause here because this is where the abstract philosophy kind of hits the pavement of hard neuroscience. You're suggesting that when a massive group of people feels the same fear, they create a feedback loop that literally takes on a life of its own.
Consider how human mirror neurons operate. We are biologically wired to detect and replicate the emotional states of those around us.
to ensure group cohesion and survival.
Exactly. So when a shared state of fear reaches a critical mass, it becomes the dominant psychological environment. It becomes an invisible entity with a singular overriding drive, which is self-preservation.
Just like a biological organism seeks to maintain homeostasis.
Yes, a collective psychological state seeks to maintain its dominance. To survive, it must continually feed on the exact same emotional energy that birthed it.
So if a society creates a massive cloud of anxiety, that cloud essentially needs the population to stay anxious in order to exist.
That's it.
Let's ground this in a highly localized individual scenario so we can truly observe the mechanics. Think of the concept of the shadow companion.
Oh, the shadow companion. Let's observe a person who has deeply internalized a narrative of chronic victimhood. For a passage of eras, they repeatedly vocalize, "I am always unlucky. Things never go right for me."
We all know someone like that, or we've been that person.
Right. They pair the cognitive thought of failure with the heavy, sinking, cortisol-drenched emotion of defeat. Over an extended duration, this repeated neurological firing physically alters the structure of their brain.
It changes the filter, right?
The reticular activating system, yeah. That's the filter in the brainstem that dictates what information gets pulled from the subconscious into conscious awareness. And it is now permanently programmed to seek out evidence of their unluckiness.
So they have literally built an invisible neurological companion, an alter ego composed entirely of their own self-defeating focus.
And because this neural pathway is deeply established, it demands activation. It becomes the shadow companion. It will subconsciously orchestrate scenarios in the physical world just to ensure its own survival.
By doing what exactly?
It operates through the subtle, continuous manipulation of attention and circumstance.
Right.
It might cause a momentary lapse in focus, ensuring the individual misplaces their keys and runs late.
Or it might subtly alter their body language during a critical negotiation.
Exactly, radiating a lack of confidence that tanks the deal. These events are orchestrated by the subconscious to elicit the emotional reaction of frustration.
Because the moment the person sighs, drops their shoulders, and says, "See, I'm always unlucky," they flood their system with the familiar chemical cocktail of defeat.
They feed the neural pathway.
They nourish the shadow companion, guaranteeing it has the strength to orchestrate another failure tomorrow.
The mechanism is entirely self-contained and brutally efficient. The individual believes they're reacting to an external world that is inherently hostile, completely blind to the reality that they are unconsciously projecting that hostility through their own altered cognition.
That shifts the entire paradigm of how we view bad luck. It's deeply unsettling, but it completely demystifies the cycle. So what happens when we apply this exact same mechanism to a macro scale?
To a whole society.
Yeah, if one person can build a personal shadow companion that ruins their morning routine, what happens when an entire society builds one? We're talking about an endless tide of interconnected nervous systems.
Well, the magnitude becomes almost incomprehensible. Massive global phenomena, profound economic stagnation, systemic social anxieties, widespread societal panic, they rarely begin as concrete physical inevitabilities.
They begin as immense collective shadow entities.
Exactly. Before an economic downturn truly solidifies its grip on the physical infrastructure, mass communication networks align the thoughts and emotions of a vast constellation of people. The collective narrative broadcasts intense fear, scarcity, and impending ruin.
So the reticular activating system of the entire culture gets reprogrammed simultaneously.
A massive proportion of humanity begins to internalize the narrative. They combine the cognitive expectation of poverty with the visceral, physiological panic of starvation. And this immense collective entity is then sustained by ensuring people continue to feel the panic of scarcity.
Which changes their behavior.
Right. Individuals stop investing, they hoard resources, they act with hostility toward neighbors. Their fear-driven behaviors crystallize the event in reality, making the physical experience of economic stagnation vastly more severe, deep, and prolonged than it mathematically needed to be.
The collective consciousness actively feeds the reality of the scarcity. This brings up a staggering implication. Are we actively engineering the invisible architects of our own misery simply by silently agreeing with the prevailing anxieties of the crowd?
That's the uncomfortable truth.
Like, when I scroll through a feed of catastrophic news and I allow that cold pit of dread to settle in my stomach, am I literally acting as a battery to sustain the exact outcome I'm terrified of?
By participating in the collective psychological frequency of fear, You are donating your cognitive and emotional bandwidth to sustain the very conceptual organism that is locking the culture in a state of paralysis.
Wow.
You're voluntarily feeding the mechanism of your own limitation. You validate the fear, which strengthens the collective neural pathway, ensuring the fearful behavior continues to manifest in the physical world.
So we are entirely complicit in the construction of our own cages.
Yeah.
But, this highlights the fundamental tension of human growth. If this immense collective gravity is constantly pulling at us, demanding our emotional energy to sustain a baseline of low-grade anxiety, what happens when someone decides to stop?
When they try to break away.
Yeah, what exactly happens in the neurological and unseen fabric of our reality when a single listener attempts to break orbit and step into a higher state of potential?
When you initiate that upward trajectory, you immediately collide with a fundamental law of both biology and collective psychology. It's the trap of energetic equilibrium.
The natural fabric of existence violently prefers balance. Right?
Balance, homeostasis, and the status quo. The brain itself is fundamentally a prediction engine. It desires predictability above all else because predictability conserves energy.
The brain is inherently lazy. It wants to run on autopilot because forming new neural pathways burns a massive proportion of metabolic fuel.
Precisely. And the collective entities, the shared psychological norms of your environment, they also demand predictability to ensure a steady, reliable food supply of emotional energy.
So when you attempt to elevate your state of being, to change your behavioral frequency and exit the collective average,
You register as a dangerous anomaly in the system.
you are threatening the food supply of your own shadow companion, and you're upsetting the equilibrium of your social environment.
The moment you attempt profound change, a psychological red alert is triggered. Your amygdala, the threat detection center of the brain, interprets the unfamiliarity of the new behavior not as growth, but as an existential danger.
A massive counterforce is immediately deployed to hammer you back into alignment.
The physiological and psychological systems deploy every weapon they have to force you back into the known, predictable state of being.
Let's dissect how this actually feels in the physical body. Think about the dawn of an ordinary day, when a listener is trying to execute a massive pivot. They sit down to write the novel they've been putting off, or they prepare to end a toxic relationship, or they launch a venture that terrifies them.
Right, the moment of action.
They sit at the desk, and they are immediately flooded with intense, overwhelming discomfort. Their chest tightens, their mind races with reasons to delay, a sudden wave of exhaustion hits them. And we're culturally conditioned to interpret that specific discomfort as a warning sign.
We think this feels terrible. It feels unnatural.
Therefore, I must be making a mistake. This path is wrong.
And that interpretation is the grand illusion. It's the ultimate trick of self-sabotage orchestrated by a nervous system desperate to return to homeostasis.
Because it's trying to save energy.
The visceral sensation of stepping outside your established baseline is intense, but we wildly misinterpret its source. The intense, suffocating discomfort you feel when striving for a new reality isn't a signal that you're heading toward disaster.
What is it then?
It is the sensation of your old neural pathways panicking as they are starved of their familiar emotional fuel.
Ah, so the anxiety isn't a premonition of failure. It's the parasite realizing it's being evicted.
That is exactly it.
The way I like to conceptualize this is through the lens of physical transformation rather than just a shift in mindset. Think about the process of extreme muscle hypertrophy. When you lift a massive weight, you are literally creating micro tears in the muscle fiber.
It's an intensely painful process.
The body floods the area with lactic acid, the nervous system screams at you to drop the weight, and the immediate aftermath is soreness and a temporary loss of strength.
The physical architecture is breaking down under the strain of a new demand.
Exactly. If you had no understanding of biology, you would interpret the pain of lifting weights as an injury. You would assume you were destroying your body, and you would immediately stop to protect yourself.
Right, because it hurts.
But because we understand the mechanism of adaptation, we know that the pain is the prerequisite for the muscle to rebuild itself denser and stronger. The discomfort isn't a sign of destruction. It is the absolute biological confirmation of growth.
The exact same principle applies to psychological architecture. The old version of you, the conceptual identity you've nourished for a passage of eras, senses that you are withdrawing its lifeblood. It's facing starvation.
So it fights back.
In its panic, it weaponizes your own nervous system against you. It projects its own existential demise into your conscious mind, tricking you into believing that its death throes are actually your own uncomfortability.
It wants you to retreat to the safety of the old habit.
which immediately restores the flow of familiar neurochemicals.
So the overwhelming majority of people who quit their ambitions are not actually failing at the ambition. They're just misinterpreting the biological sensation of change.
Yes. They feel the resistance, they assume it's a cosmic stop sign, and they run right back to the comfort of the old habit.
But the resistance is actually the ultimate confirmation that you are successfully breaking orbit.
If there were no pushback from your nervous system or your environment, it would serve as absolute proof that you hadn't changed your frequency at all. You would still be matching the pace of the treadmill.
This is where we have to pivot from the theoretical to the intensely practical. To sever these invisible tethers of equilibrium, to actually withstand the psychological burden of adaptation without running back to the old baseline, we have to examine the tools we're using.
The linguistic traps.
Yes, the collective equilibrium maintains its grip on us through language. We're dragged back into the old patterns by the very words coming out of our mouths. So we need to dissect the specific sequence of linguistic traps. Let's begin with the first saboteur, a phrase that is incredibly deceptive because society universally champions it as a profound virtue.
It's championed because it appears harmless, even optimistic. The first linguistic trap, the first saboteur of human potential is the phrase, I hope.
I hope. It is the default setting of our communication. I hope the interview goes well. I hope my test results come back clear. I hope we can repair this relationship. It sounds positive. It sounds entirely forward-looking. Why is this phrase acting as a warden?
Well, it sounds positive to the conscious ear, but if we analyze the neurological and energetic signature of the concept of hope, we expose it as a vessel of sheer uncertainty. Yes. In the realm of materializing a new reality, the brain and the external environment do not respond to vague, ambiguous wishes. They require absolute directional clarity. Uncertainty emits a profoundly weak, static-filled psychological frequency. It keeps the brain suspended in a state of chronic unpredictability.
Because hoping for an outcome implicitly acknowledges that there is an equal terrifying chance that the outcome will not happen.
Precisely the mechanism. Hope fundamentally admits and reserves energetic space for the possibility of failure. When you say, I hope I succeed, you are simultaneously broadcasting the desire for the achievement and the deep-seated terror of the loss.
You're splitting your cognitive focus.
Exactly. Your brain's threat detection system remains highly active because the outcome is unresolved. Cortisol remains elevated. Furthermore, hope operates as an incredibly insidious psychological defense mechanism.
It's a buffer. By saying, I hope it works out, I'm secretly building a cognitive safety net. I'm preparing a soft landing for my own ego just in case I fall flat on my face.
You're preparing for the worst.
Yeah, if I fail, I can console myself by saying, well, I only hoped it would happen. I wasn't entirely counting on it. I didn't risk everything.
You are investing a massive proportion of your mental energy in the contingency plan of failure. However, the psychological law of manifestation is uncompromising. The active avoidance of disappointment guarantees the avoidance of realizing the desired outcome.
Oh, wow.
If you withhold your absolute, uncompromising certainty to protect your ego from getting bruised, you withhold the very activation energy required to command your environment. You keep yourself in a perpetual state of waiting.
Let me push back on this a bit because I can hear the audience bristling at the idea that hope is a negative force. I mean, isn't hope the singular force that has sustained humanity through the darkest, most oppressive eras of history?
It is, yes.
When a population is facing unimaginable hardship, absolute tyranny, or profound personal grief, isn't hope the tiny, vital flame that keeps them from completely surrendering to the void?
That is a profound observation, and it highlights a crucial, nuanced distinction in how we deploy our psychological tools. Hope is indeed a vital initial spark. When an individual is submerged in the absolute crushing depths of despair, when the nervous system is completely shut down in a state of freeze hope, is the momentary jolt of adrenaline required to pull them back from the abyss.
It wakes them up.
It is the sudden, illuminating realization that circumstances could theoretically be different. It serves a profound, undeniable survival purpose.
It's the defibrillator for a dying spirit. But a defibrillator is designed to restart the heart, not to serve as a permanent pacemaker.
Exactly. It's a spark, but it is a terrible foundation upon which to construct a lasting architecture of reality. If you attempt to live your entire existence in a chronic state of hope, you remain forever trapped in the waiting room of your own life.
Always anticipating a future salvation that never arrives.
Right. The initial spark of hope must rapidly purposefully and aggressively evolve into the roaring, sustaining fire of absolute knowing. You must use hope to get off the floor, but you must use absolute certainty to walk through the door and build a new world.
Use hope as a life preserver, not as the ship itself. That distinction clarifies everything. So we must violently excise the chronic use of "I hope" from our daily vocabulary. What is the psychological antidote?
The antidote is absolute, uncompromising certainty. You replace the hesitation of "I hope" with the solid bedrock of "I know." The ultimate elixir of reality creation, the neurochemical state that actually alters behavior and perception, is unwavering confidence.
I know. I want to linger on the specific texture of that certainty. It's not a frantic, desperate, hyper-emotional kind of belief. The best way to describe the exact feeling of knowing is to use a deeply mundane mechanical analogy. Think about setting the destination on a GPS navigation system. You type in the address, and you press Start. As you put the car in drive, you do not sit gripping the steering wheel, sweating, crossing your fingers, and hoping that the satellite system will magically pave a road in front of you.
You do not engage emotionally with the possibility of the route failing to exist.
Exactly. You simply put the car in gear and drive. Your mind is entirely at peace regarding the existence of the destination. You know the satellite has calculated the route. You might hit traffic, you might have to take a detour, but the absolute boring mechanical certainty that the destination is fixed remains unshakable.
That's the perfect way to describe it.
That exact intensity of mundane expectation, the calm assumption of an inevitable result, is the psychological state that must be applied to your internal desires. You don't hope the venture succeeds. You know the coordinates are locked in.
When you shift from hoping to knowing, you fundamentally alter your neurochemical state. By eliminating the uncertainty, you downregulate the amygdala. You signal to your nervous system that the environment is safe and the outcome is secure.
Which changes how your brain processes information.
This shift in state pulls metabolic energy away from the fight-or-flight centers and pushes it into the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for complex problem-solving, strategic planning, and pattern recognition.
So, by declaring, "I know," you literally turn on the parts of your brain required to actually spot the opportunities that will make the goal a reality. Hope blinds you with stress. Knowing opens your eyes with calm focus.
To contextualize this shift, we can observe an ancient universal narrative of healing that perfectly illustrates the dynamic.
I know the one you mean.
The specific cultural details vary, but the core psychological architecture of the event remains identical across human history. A fundamentally ill individual, desperate and suffering for a passage of eras, seeks recovery from a renowned master, a figure universally believed to hold miraculous external power.
Right.
The afflicted individual pushes through a massive, chaotic crowd, driven by a singular, burning, unshakable conviction. They reach out, they touch the master's garment, and upon doing so, they experience an instantaneous, radical transformation. The illness evaporates.
And the conventional surface-level interpretation is that the master transmitted a magical external energy to cure them.
That is the externalized misunderstanding of the mechanism. In the truest, most unfiltered versions of this narrative, the master clarifies a profound truth to the surrounding crowd. The master turns and explicitly states, "It was not my external power that orchestrated your healing. Your absolute, unwavering internal certainty activated the change."
The master was just a focal point.
The master was merely a physical focal point, a culturally accepted excuse for the individual's mind to finally give itself permission to shift from a state of chronic fear into a state of absolute commanding certainty.
The placebo effect on a cosmic scale. The belief itself is the active ingredient. This perfectly bridges us to the next trap. While the illusion of hope signals doubt and creates a weak, static-filled psychological frequency, the second phrase in our sequence broadcasts something vastly more damaging to our internal architecture.
It broadcasts a state of fundamental lack.
We arrive at the second linguistic saboteur, the endlessly repeated phrase, "I need."
I need.
I need a higher-paying career. I need to find a compatible partner. I need more time. We utter these declarations constantly under the assumption that we are simply making an objective assessment of our current physical circumstances. We view it as a harmless inventory of reality. Why is this specific phrasing so psychologically destructive?
Because the vocalization of a need is a psychological confession of inherent lack. It's a declaration of unimportance and a stance of profound emotional dependence on the external world. You are continuously signaling to your own nervous system that you are fundamentally incomplete in your present state.
And the brain aligns its perception of reality to match that internal confession.
It must. The human experience operates on a frustratingly precise, almost paradoxical mechanism. You can only sustainably possess in the physical external realm what you have already materialized in your internal emotional realm.
So needing pushes it away.
When you declare a deep, desperate need, you are actively pushing the object of your desire away. You are creating a vast, unbridgeable expanse of energetic and psychological space between your current identity and your desired outcome.
Let's unpack the cognitive mechanics of this. By saying, I need an opportunity, my brain registers that statement as an absolute confirmation that I currently do not have an opportunity.
Exactly.
My reticular activating system locks onto the state of not having. And because the brain is a confirmation engine always seeking to prove its own core beliefs correct, it will actively filter out opportunities just to maintain the consistency of my belief that I am lacking.
That is the cognitive trap. The external environment merely mirrors your dominant state of being. If your dominant internal state is the desperate, grasping frequency of needing, your subconscious will generously guide you toward endless circumstances, decisions, and relationships that allow you to continue experiencing the state of needing.
You essentially program the GPS to drive you to a town called lack, and then you act surprised when you never arrive at abundance. It's the invisible treadmill manifesting again.
To permanently dismantle this trap, we must expose the philosophical core of human desire. This concept often triggers immense resistance, but it is absolute. Human beings do not actually desire physical objects, societal statuses, specific interpersonal relationships, or ascending numbers in a financial ledger.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Of course people desire those things. Entire global economies are built on the active pursuit of those exact things. People sacrifice massive proportions of their lives chasing them.
They dedicate their lives to the chase, yes, but those external acquisitions are merely proxies. They are middlemen. What you and every other conscious being truly desire at the core of your existence is to feel differently than you do right now in this exact moment.
That requires a massive perspective shift. Let me process that. I don't actually want the prestigious promotion. I want the feeling of absolute security and peer validation that I assume the promotion will finally grant me.
Yes.
I don't desire the massive house. I desire the feeling of expansive freedom and sanctuary that I associate with the physical structure. The object is just a delivery mechanism for an emotion.
Precisely. You are chasing an internal emotional shift. You hold the mistaken belief that the external acquisition is the unique physical key required to unlock that specific internal neurochemical state. But that approach is entirely backward. Because your desired external reality is merely a middleman for a feeling, you possess the inherent capacity to cut out the middleman entirely.
So if I need keeps me trapped in a state of lack by focusing on the absence of the middleman, what is the psychological antidote?
The phrase, I need, must be completely and ruthlessly transformed into the immediate declaration of, I have. You collapse the massive psychological space between your current self and your desire by granting yourself absolute permission to experience the emotion of the accomplishment in the present moment right now, completely independent of your surrounding physical circumstances.
You render the external desire functionally irrelevant by already embodying the feeling it was supposed to provide.
Let me illustrate this with the observation of an agrarian entrepreneur who orchestrated a monumental, almost incomprehensible expansion of physical abundance. For an extensive duration, they struggled immensely.
Operating from need.
They operated entirely from a state of desperate need, staring out at their barren, struggling fields and desperately needing the soil to produce a yield. They were consumed by the anxiety of lack.
So what changed?
The turning point in their physical reality was not the sudden implementation of a revolutionary agricultural strategy, nor the acquisition of advanced machinery.
The pivot was entirely internal.
A profound internal restructuring. They intentionally cultivated a state of consciousness where they felt entirely, deeply, and emotionally fulfilled without witnessing any change in their physical reality.
How did it do that?
They would walk through their dusty, struggling fields while intentionally radiating the absolute fullness, gratitude, and deep security of an overwhelmingly successful harvest. They physically embodied the posture of success. They felt the pride, the relief, the abundance long before a single green sprout broke the surface of the soil.
They manufactured the neurochemical state of victory independently of the environment.
And the moment that profound emotional dependence on the external outcome dissolved, the moment they truly felt the absolute resonance of I have, while standing directly in the center of physical lack, their perception shifted.
The cognitive bandwidth expanded.
By removing the stress of need, their cognitive bandwidth expanded. They began to notice subtle shifts in the soil, slight changes in the weather patterns, micro-opportunities that their desperate, narrowed focus had previously blinded them to. The external reality inevitably aligned with their internal abundance because their internal state dictated a completely new set of behaviors. The harvest that followed was staggering.
The analogy that perfectly captures this dynamic is the concept of a shadow cast by a moving light. Imagine you are in a dark room and a light source is projecting a sharp shadow onto the far wall.
Okay, a shadow on the wall.
You, operating from a state of lack and need, decide that you must capture and hold on to that shadow. So you sprint toward the wall. But the shadow is merely a projection. The faster and more desperately you sprint toward the shadow representing your need, the faster the light source shifts and the faster the shadow eludes your grasp. You can exhaust yourself for a lifetime desperately lunging at a projection.
A lifetime of running on the treadmill, endlessly chasing a mirage.
Exactly. The only conceivable way to command the shadow, the only way to dictate the reality, is to completely stop running. You must stand perfectly still, turn your back on the shadow on the wall, and embody the light source itself.
Become the light.
You have to become the energetic center that casts the reality. The feeling of having is the light source. The physical manifestation in the external world is simply the unavoidable shadow it casts.
But that analogy perfectly encapsulates the psychological law. When you embody the light source, when your nervous system vibrates with the absolute fullness of I have, the shadow of physical manifestation has no alternative but to fall perfectly and naturally at your feet. The external result becomes a secondary, almost boring side effect of your internal state.
This framework is deeply empowering, but it also reveals the immense level of internal discipline required to maintain it. We've systematically dismantled the hesitant doubt of hope, and we've collapsed the expansive void of lack created by need.
But we have one more.
But now, we must confront the final trap. We must address what is arguably the most deeply ingrained, culturally celebrated, and insidious saboteur of all. We're moving to the ultimate abdication of individual sovereignty.
We're arriving at the third linguistic saboteur, the willing surrender to fate.
If it is meant to be, it will be. It's entirely out of my hands. The universe has a grand plan. We encounter these phrases constantly. They're offered as a soothing balm to a grieving friend. They are utilized as a rationalization for a collapsed business venture. They are the ultimate universal sigh of resignation.
And we frame this surrender as a form of spiritual maturity or peaceful acceptance.
Right. But why is it so dangerous?
I must deliver a profound philosophical blow here, one that shatters the comfortable illusion of that resignation. The concept of fate, when defined as an external preordained script dictating the inescapable events of your life, is a fabricated idol.
A fabricated idol.
It is a conceptual myth meticulously designed by the human ego to relieve the individual of the terrifying burden of their own generative power.
That is an incredibly intense paradigm to shift. A fabricated idol. You are suggesting that there is no grand external prayer book orchestrating our lessons.
Attributing the trajectory of your existence to an external, unseen will, regardless of the cultural or philosophical name you assign to that will, is the ultimate abandonment of the infinite potential resting dormant within your own cognitive architecture.
You give your power away.
It is a fundamental refusal to accept the raw, foundational nature of existence. Reality is, at its core, a blank canvas of absolute neutrality. Events do not possess inherent preassigned meaning. Physical conditions do not possess an inherent unchangeable trajectory.
Reality is just raw, unformatted data.
Exactly. The raw data of reality only assumes a mask, a meaning, a moral weight, and a specific direction when you, the conscious observer, assign those attributes to it through your psychological filters and behavioral responses.
Let's examine the practical danger of this abdication. When a listener reaches a critical juncture in their life, perhaps a massive career transition that requires a leap of faith, or the decision to salvage a failing relationship, and they utter the words, well, I will just wait and see. If it is meant to be, it will naturally happen. What is actually occurring within their psychological framework and their external environment?
When you utter that specific phrase, your subconscious registers a distinct, deliberate refusal to take the helm of your own ship. You are standing on the bridge, staring directly at the steering wheel, and willfully stepping away, declaring that the random currents of the ocean should dictate your ultimate destination.
And because you consciously decline to act as the architect of the moment.
Reality immediately defaults to the path of least resistance.
And what exactly dictates the path of least resistance?
Absolute chaos. And more specifically, the chaotic pulling whims of the collective hive mind we discussed at the beginning of our exploration.
The collective shadow entities.
Yes. If you do not actively, forcefully dictate your reality through conscious intention, the collective shadow entities, the ambient anxieties, fears, and low-grade panic of your surrounding culture will happily dictate it for you. They will steer your unpiloted ship directly towards scenarios that harvest your emotional energy for their own survival.
You become passive collateral damage to the prevailing neuroses of the era.
Exactly.
You essentially leave the front door of your mind wide open, allowing any stray societal panic or collective frustration to walk in, set up shop, and run your life.
Precisely. A foundational thinker of human psychology, a pioneer who deeply understood the hidden mechanics of the mind, observed a chilling, undeniable truth about this phenomenon. They noted that until we actively illuminate the invisible, autonomous workings of our subconscious programming, those hidden scripts will continuously direct our actions, subtly orchestrate our failures, and draw us into endlessly repeating tragedies.
And we won't even know it's happening.
Right. And because we remain entirely blind to our own internal authorship of these events, we will helplessly look at the recurring wreckage of our lives and label every self-inflicted misfortune as fate.
We invent an invisible scriptwriter to blame for the tragic movie we are secretly directing ourselves. That is a brutal realization.
We project our own unacknowledged power outward, assign it the label of fate, and bow in submission to it. It is a tragic, self-perpetuating loop of powerlessness.
So how do we shatter the loop? What is the psychological antidote to the passive surrender of "if it is meant to be"?
The phrase, "if it is meant to be," must be transformed into an absolute, unwavering, active command. You state, "it is meant to be," or to be even more accurate to the mechanism, "I am the architect." You reclaim the outward projection of power and pull it back into your own center.
I am the architect, the ultimate internal locus of control.
The infinite potentiality of existence, the raw, vibrating fabric of the world around you, cannot act for you. It possesses no hands of its own. It harbors no independent, pre-calculated desire for the trajectory of your life. It can only act through your active conscious command.
The raw material of reality waits dormant until you strike the anvil with the hammer of your absolute certainty.
Exactly.
I have to wrestle with the monumental weight of this concept, though. I think a vast proportion of our listeners are going to experience a profound sense of psychological vertigo hearing this. Because if fate is an illusion, if there is no external grand design orchestrating our struggles to teach us lessons, that implies there are no accidents.
None at all.
And far more terrifyingly, it implies there are absolutely no external forces left to blame when things go violently, catastrophically wrong in our lives.
That realization is the absolute crux of human maturity.
If my massive venture collapses, it is not because the universe decided it wasn't meant to be. It is because my internal psychological state, my focus, or my actions were misaligned. If I find myself chronically lonely, it is not a curse of my fate. It is the direct result of my own relational architecture. How does a single person begin to carry the monumental, almost crushing weight of absolute responsibility for every single facet of their experience? It feels infinitely easier and safer to just blame the external world.
It is infinitely easier to blame the external world, which is exactly why the overwhelming majority of humanity chooses to remain asleep on the treadmill, living lives of quiet frustration. But carrying this monumental weight, the absolute uncompromising responsibility for every condition of your existence, is the only true functional definition of freedom.
Freedom accessed exclusively through ultimate responsibility.
Yes. When you finally realize that no external savior is coming to rescue you and simultaneously realize that no grand external force is plotting to destroy you, the initial vertigo is undeniably terrifying. You are completely alone at the helm.
But that terror fades.
But that initial terror is rapidly replaced by an intoxicating, expansive realization of absolute sovereignty. If you are the one who unconsciously built the prison through your habits and vocabulary, you inherently possess the exact blueprints required to dismantle it.
That is profound.
The weight of absolute responsibility is functionally identical to the weight of infinite power. You cannot claim the power to create a miraculous, expansive life without simultaneously bravely accepting the responsibility for the miseries and limitations you have currently manifested.
You cannot selectively own your power. You have to own the shadows in order to command the light.
Exactly. When you declare, "I am the architect," you cease functioning as a passive victim of random circumstance, and you step into the role of the active cause of your environment. You dictate the terms of engagement.
This has been a staggering, paradigm-shifting journey. Let's synthesize the massive expanse of territory we've uncovered in this discussion, pulling all of these mechanisms together for you, the listener.
A quick recap.
We began by observing the invisible wardens, the collective gravity of the societal hive mind that sustains itself by feeding on our passive, shared frustrations. We examined the violent biological pushback of energetic equilibrium, the nervous system's desperate attempt to maintain the status quo when we try to break free, and we systematically identified and dismantled the triad of linguistic chains that keep us bound to the treadmill.
The foundational takeaway is that we are not fragile, insignificant life forms bobbing helplessly on the chaotic tides of random circumstance. We are the resonant centers of our own experience, and the environment merely reflects our dominant state.
The everyday words we use are not just passive descriptors of our day. They are the active, literal scaffolding of our external world. By intentionally shifting your vocabulary, you fundamentally alter your neurological state and your behavioral output.
It all comes down to the phrasing.
You must transition from the hesitant, stress-inducing doubt of hope to the calm, mechanical, absolute certainty of knowing. You must pivot from the vast, blinding cognitive chasm of need to the immediate, expansive emotional fullness of having. And finally, you must abandon the comfortable, cowardly surrender of fate and rise into the absolute, uncompromising sovereignty of the architect. By making these specific shifts, you sever the invisible tethers of the collective mind.
But a critical warning is necessary here as a direct, practical application for the listener. Embodying this sovereignty requires immense, localized, and continuous cognitive effort. The physical universe, your own biology, and the collective entities within your social environment will aggressively test this newly claimed architecture.
They will push back.
They will push back with significant force. When you declare, "I know," external circumstances will temporarily arise that seem perfectly designed to make you doubt. When you declare, "I have," the physical illusion of lack may temporarily amplify to test your resolve. You must stand firm in the initial discomfort of your new psychological baseline. You must simply outlast the panic of your old, starving neural pathways.
You have to hold the new posture until the external environment has no choice but to change its shape to accommodate you.
Precisely the goal.
We have mapped a vast, complex terrain today, exploring the profound psychological and linguistic mechanics of how we actively shape our daily reality. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a solitary spark to ignite your own contemplation as you step away from this exploration and back into your daily routine.
What's the thought?
Consider the physical environment surrounding you in this exact moment. Look around the room you are sitting in. Look at the device you are listening on, the specific texture of your current relationships, the state of your career, and the baseline level of stress in your body. What if every single object, every condition, and every limitation you currently perceive is not a solid, immovable, objective fact,
Not merely a reflection.
but merely the hardened, fossilized echo of a casual, unconscious conversation you had with yourself in the distant past? And if that is the reality of human experience, if your current world is nothing more than the physical shadow cast by yesterday's unexamined words, what will the grand architecture of your world look like tomorrow, based entirely on the absolute certainties you consciously choose to declare today?